I told my family I had 2 weeks left to live over Sunday pot roast and mashed potatoes, and my daughter-in-law asked about the house before she asked how much time I had left. The dining room went so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway dragging each second across the floorboards. I had set the table with my good china, the ivory plates with the thin gold rim I only used on birthdays, holidays, and the kind of evenings when I still pretended family meant comfort. Outside, the late October wind rattled the maple branches against the kitchen window. Inside, my son stared at me like he had forgotten how to breathe. Vanessa, on the other hand, recovered first. She always did. Her fork slipped from her hand and clinked against the plate, a small bright sound in the silence, but by the time Daniel reached for his water glass, she was already lifting her napkin to her mouth and composing her face into something careful and concerned. I had spent 3 days preparing that meal. Pot roast slow-cooked for 6 hours. Buttered green beans. Yeast rolls brushed with melted honey. Daniel's favorite peach cobbler cooling on the counter. The kind of meal a mother makes when she wants the room to feel warm enough to soften whatever comes next. I waited until they had nearly finished eating. Waited until Daniel had gone back for seconds. Waited until Vanessa had complimented the roast in that polished voice she used when she wanted to sound gracious. Then I folded my napkin, laid it beside my plate, and told them the doctor had found something serious. I said there was no gentle way to put it. I said the tests were clear. I said, according to the specialist, I likely had 2 weeks left. Daniel went pale so quickly it startled me. At 41, my son still had the same blue eyes he'd had as a boy, still the same habit of going very still when something frightened him. "Mom," he said, barely above a whisper. Just that one word. Nothing after it. Vanessa turned to him first. Not to me. To him. Her hand moved to his wrist. Her expression tightened in all the right places. Anyone watching would have called it concern. I watched her count. Not out loud. Not visibly. But I watched it happen all the same. Her eyes flicked toward the hallway. Toward the study. Toward the framed deed copy on the far shelf where Harold had once joked we kept every important paper except the ones people actually needed. Then she looked back at me and asked, in the softest voice at the table, "Should we move up the estate paperwork?" Daniel turned to her so fast his chair legs scraped against the hardwood. I kept my face still. I had expected tears. Awkward sympathy. A hand across the table, maybe. I had expected Daniel to ask if I was in pain. I had expected Vanessa to offer to drive me to appointments, or at least pretend to. Instead, she asked about paperwork while my peach cobbler was still warm. I remember noticing the steam lifting from Daniel's plate. I remember the smell of rosemary and onions still hanging in the room. I remember thinking grief, when it's real, reaches for a person. Greed reaches for a folder. It's not immediate, I said, and even to my own ears my voice sounded calm, almost kind. There's still time. Vanessa nodded too quickly. Of course, she said, pressing her palm lightly to her chest. I just meant, we should make things easier for you. Less stress. Better to organize everything now. Organize everything. Such a clean phrase for such an ugly thought. Daniel finally looked at me again. His eyes were wet now, or trying to be. What do you need from us? He asked. It was the right question. It came too late. I looked at my son. I looked at the woman beside him. And in that long, polished silence, I understood that whatever happened in the next 2 weeks, I was no longer waiting to find out who loved me. I was waiting to see how quickly they would show me what they wanted. They stayed 43 minutes after dinner. I know because I watched the minute hand drag its way around the brass clock above the stove while I cleared plates no one offered to carry. Daniel stood near the sink, useless in the way men sometimes become when discomfort asks too much of them. He kept rubbing the back of his neck, opening his mouth, then closing it again. Vanessa followed me into the kitchen with that careful softness she wore like perfume. She touched my elbow while I wrapped the leftover roast in foil, her voice lowered into something intimate enough to sound kind. She asked if I had called my attorney. Not if I had called my doctor. Not if I needed help sleeping. Not if I wanted someone to stay the night. My attorney. I told her no, not yet. I said I was tired. I said I needed a little time to think. She smiled in a way that showed no teeth and offered to help me make a list. Practical things, she called them. Accounts. Titles. Passwords. You should not be carrying that alone, she said, and for one brief second Daniel looked relieved, as if kindness had finally entered the room. Then she added, it will be much easier for Daniel if everything is organized before things get hard. Before things get hard. As though I had not just told them I was dying. As though the difficult part was not the dying but the filing. Daniel drove home in silence, I suspect. Vanessa was already talking when they stepped onto the porch. I could tell by the shape of her mouth through the lace curtain above the sink. Fast. Controlled. Certain. Daniel nodded twice before he opened the passenger door for her. He did not look back at the house. By 10:30, the dishes were dried and put away. The roast was in the refrigerator. The cobbler sat untouched on the counter, its sugared crust collapsed in the center where the heat had left it. I made a cup of chamomile tea and carried it upstairs with both hands, more for steadiness than comfort. My bedroom had been too large since Harold died. At night it felt larger. His side of the bed remained neat in a way that still felt unnatural, the quilt smooth and undisturbed, the lamp on his nightstand gathering dust around the switch. I changed into my robe, washed my face, and sat on the edge of the mattress listening to the old house settle into itself. At 11:12, headlights swept across my bedroom ceiling. Daniel's sedan. Back again. I did not move. A car door shut softly. Then another. Their voices drifted up through the open den window below my room, blurred at first, then sharpened by the stillness. You should have waited, Daniel said. His voice was low, strained. Vanessa answered him in the clipped tone she used when patience had become inconvenient. For what, Daniel? Sentiment. I set my tea on the nightstand and went still enough to hear every word. She is scared, he said. Then this is exactly when she signs whatever we put in front of her, Vanessa replied. There was a pause. I could picture her there in the driveway, one hand on the strap of her purse, chin lifted, already irritated by his hesitation. We do not have time to be emotional about this. If the house is not transferred cleanly, probate will drag everything out for months. And I am not dealing with that while planning Christmas. Christmas. I sat in the dark and stared at the doorway. Daniel said something too low to catch. Vanessa answered more sharply this time. Your mother has had this house to herself for 9 years. Let us not pretend she was leaving it to charity. I waited for him to defend me. I waited for him to remind his wife that this house had been mine before it was ever his to inherit. I waited for him to say my name the way a son should say it when someone speaks carelessly about his mother. He did not. What came instead was silence. Long enough to say everything. Then, quieter, Daniel asked, do you think she has updated the will? I do not remember reaching for Harold's photograph, only that my fingers were already resting against the silver frame by the time Vanessa answered. Not yet, she said. But she will. Which is why we need to be very careful what she hears from now on. That was the moment something inside me cooled completely. Not broke. Not shattered. Cooled. Clean and still and hard enough to hold its shape. I had not misheard the question at dinner. I had not imagined the speed of her calculation. And now, standing in the dark with my dead husband's picture in my hand, I understood something far more useful than grief. By the time their car pulled away, I was no longer wondering whether my family loved me. I was wondering how much they thought my death was worth. By 8 the next morning, Vanessa had flowers at my front door and Daniel had suddenly remembered how to call before noon. The arrangement was white lilies, expensive and overly fragrant, the kind people send when they want to rehearse grief before it is necessary. The card said thinking of you in elegant gold script, unsigned except for a neat little heart beneath Vanessa's name. I left the flowers in the foyer where I could smell them without having to pretend they comforted me. Daniel called at 8:14. His voice was soft in the careful, practiced way people use when they are trying to sound gentler than they feel. He asked if I had slept. He asked if I had eaten. Then, after a pause just long enough to resemble concern, he asked whether I had found the paperwork for the house. I stood at the kitchen counter in my robe, looking out at the bird feeder Harold had built the summer before he died, and stirred cream into my coffee until it went cold. Not yet, I told him. There is still time. He exhaled in a way that sounded almost like relief. By 10 o'clock, Vanessa was in my kitchen wearing a camel wool coat and a sympathetic expression she had likely practiced in the mirror. She carried scones from the bakery downtown, the expensive one she had once called wasteful when Harold was alive and still paying for Sunday brunch. She set the white box on my counter and kissed my cheek with the delicate restraint of someone performing kindness for an invisible audience. "I thought you should not be alone today," she said. It was a lovely sentence. It would have meant more if she had ever said it before. She moved through my kitchen as if grief had already made the house communal. She filled my kettle without asking. Opened cabinets she had never once offered to help organize. Took down 2 teacups and chose the good spoons. Not the everyday set. The silver. I watched her do it all with a kind of detached clarity that would have frightened me a week earlier. Now it only sharpened my attention. "Daniel worries you will try to manage too much on your own," she said as she set a plate between us. "He wants to make sure things are simple for you." Simple. Another clean word. I asked if Daniel always worried this much when lawyers were involved. She laughed, too quickly, and reached for my hand across the table. "Evelyn, no one is thinking about money." She said it while wearing the bracelet Harold gave me on my 60th birthday. I had wondered where it went after she borrowed it for Easter and forgot to return it. There it was, glinting at my kitchen table while she lied to my face. I let my gaze rest on it for one beat too long. She turned her wrist under the sleeve of her coat. "What everyone is thinking about," she continued, "is making sure your wishes are clear. It is such a burden for families when things are left uncertain." I asked what she thought my wishes were. She smiled into her tea. "That Daniel is taken care of. That the house stays in the family. That no one has to fight over details later. Not one mention of me. Not one mention of comfort. Only transfer. Containment. Possession dressed up as responsibility." Just after noon, Sophie let herself in through the back door the way she had since she was 10, one backpack slung over her shoulder, wind in her hair, honesty still intact on her face. At 19, she had Harold's steadiness and none of her mother's polish. She stopped short when she saw Vanessa at the table and looked from her mother to me with the quick, quiet intelligence of someone who already understood more than adults expected her to. "I brought your crossword book," she said, lifting the grocery bag in her hand. She had also brought soup, fresh sourdough, and the raspberry yogurt I liked and Vanessa always claimed was too much sugar for someone my age. Sophie set everything on the counter and came straight to me. She kissed my temple, squeezed my shoulder, and asked only one question. "Are you scared?" It was the first honest question anyone had asked me since Sunday dinner. Vanessa stood to gather cups that did not need gathering. I looked at my granddaughter and saw, all at once, the single uncalculated face in the room. "Not anymore," I told her, and for the first time since this began, I meant it. Sophie stayed after Vanessa left, long enough to rinse the teacups and wipe down the counter with the faded yellow dish towel that had hung by my sink for nearly 15 years. She moved quietly through the kitchen, not with the entitlement her mother wore in my home, but with the easy familiarity of someone who had loved this house before she understood what ownership meant. She did not press me with questions. She did not circle the room looking for papers. She sliced the sourdough, ladled soup into 2 bowls, and sat across from me with Harold's old crossword book open between us like the afternoon was ordinary and not carefully splitting my family down the middle. It gave me space enough to think, and once I began, I could not stop seeing it. There is a particular kind of cruelty that does not arrive all at once. It arrives in revisions, in omissions, in the slow rearranging of your place in a room until one day you realize no one saved you a chair. Vanessa had never been careless enough to be openly unkind in the beginning. She had been strategic, charming in public, attentive when witnesses were near. She brought lemon bars to church suppers and remembered birthdays when there were photographs to prove it. The first time she excluded me, Daniel said it was a misunderstanding. Their first Thanksgiving after the wedding, She moved dinner to her sister's at the last minute and told me she assumed I would enjoy a quiet holiday after such a busy week. Daniel arrived on my porch the next morning with leftover pie and an apology too rehearsed to be his own. The second time, she scheduled Sophie's piano recital on the same afternoon as my retirement luncheon and acted surprised I could not be in two places at once. "We thought you would understand," she said, already collecting coats before I had answered. I had spent 32 years as a school librarian. They sent flowers. She sent a scheduling conflict. After Harold died, the edits became bolder. Sunday dinners moved from weekly to occasional. Then occasional became difficult. Then difficult became forgotten. There was always a reason. Daniel was tired. Vanessa was overwhelmed. The roads were bad. Sophie had homework. Christmas brunch became Christmas dessert. Then coffee after New Year's. Then a text with a snowman and no invitation at all. Each excuse arrived dressed as circumstance. Each one left the same bruise. I had mistaken pattern for accident because mothers are fluent in mercy. We make explanations for what we do not want to name. We call neglect busyness. We call selfishness stress. We call humiliation a misunderstanding and keep setting an extra place at the table. Sophie broke my thoughts by reaching for another clue in Harold's crossword and asking if I remembered the summer she was 12 and begged to repaint the guest room lavender. I did remember. She had spent 2 days with paint on her elbows and a ribbon in her hair, chattering from breakfast until dusk while Vanessa complained the fumes were giving her a headache. "Mom hated that room," Sophie said, eyes still on the page. "She said you were wasting money fixing spaces no one important used." No one important. I remembered the exact afternoon. I remembered Vanessa standing in that doorway with one hand on her hip, watching Harold help Sophie tape the baseboards. I remembered Harold smiling without looking up and saying, "Every room in this house matters if the right person is standing in it." He had known then. Perhaps not everything. But enough. I looked around my kitchen and began to see the shape of the years more clearly than I ever had while living them. The forgotten invitations. The redirected holidays. The subtle corrections. The polished little humiliations so small each one could be denied on its own and so consistent they became architecture. Daniel had not built that architecture, but he had lived in it comfortably enough to stop noticing the walls. Sophie circled a word in the puzzle and glanced up at me. Grandpa used to say people show you what they value by what they protect. I folded my hands around my teacup and let that settle between us. Harold had protected me in 100 quiet ways I had only fully learned to recognize after he was gone. Daniel had inherited his father's eyes and none of his courage. Vanessa had mistaken my patience for blindness. Across the table, Sophie turned another page in the crossword and asked if I wanted to keep going. I looked at my granddaughter, at the only person in my family who had entered this house carrying food instead of plans, and understood with startling clarity that not all inheritance arrives in paper. The next morning, I bought a legal pad at the pharmacy on Maple Street and began writing everything down. Not because I needed help remembering. Because memory becomes evidence the moment people start pretending they never said what they said. I sat at the kitchen table beneath the window over the sink, the one Harold once widened himself because he said a woman ought to have something decent to look at while doing ordinary things, and I made a list. Sunday dinner. Estate paperwork before dessert. Accounts. Titles. Passwords. It will be easier for Daniel. No one is thinking about money. We need to be very careful what she hears from now on. I wrote each sentence exactly as I remembered it. Then I wrote the time. The room. Who was holding what when they said it. Vanessa with her hand on Daniel's wrist. Daniel by the sink. Vanessa in the driveway. It is remarkable how precise the mind becomes once the heart stops interrupting. By noon, I had 3 pages. By 2, I had 6. Small things returned with humiliating clarity. Vanessa asking where Harold kept the safe key 3 days after his funeral. Daniel forwarding me a property tax notice with no greeting, only the words we should discuss long-term plans. Vanessa offering to help simplify my jewelry box after church one Easter. The silver bracelet still on her wrist. I did not dramatize. I did not embellish. I simply recorded. At 3:15, Daniel called to say he and Vanessa wanted to take me to lunch the following day. He suggested the country club, a place they had not invited me in nearly 2 years because, as Vanessa once put it, the membership crowd had become a little younger. I told him lunch sounded lovely. He sounded relieved enough to be suspicious. "We just want to spend time with you," he said. I wrote that down too. Sophie came by after her afternoon class with a paper sack from the deli and a look on her face I recognized before she spoke. She set my turkey sandwich on the table and lowered her voice, though we were alone. "Mom was on the phone in the den this morning," she said. "She thought I was upstairs." I waited. Sophie slipped into the chair across from me and folded her hands, not unlike Harold when he was deciding how carefully to tell the truth. She was talking to a realtor. The room did not move. I simply felt it settle. She said she wanted to move quickly before the market cooled and that the house would show better after a clean out. Sophie's mouth tightened on the last 2 words. Then she laughed and said, "If we time this right, we can have it listed before Thanksgiving." Before Thanksgiving. It was the 2nd week of October. I looked down at the legal pad between us, at 6 pages of careful ink, and felt something almost merciful leave me. Not hope. Not grief. Hesitation. "Did she mention Daniel?" I asked. Sophie nodded once. She said he was still sentimental, but he would come around once the numbers were in front of him. I let that sit between us for a long moment. Outside, a leaf skittered across the porch in the dry afternoon wind. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the block, a lawn mower started and stopped. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary day. My daughter-in-law was planning the sale of my home while I was still buying groceries. Sophie reached across the table and touched the corner of the legal pad with one finger. "Grandma," she said carefully, "what are you doing?" I looked at the pages, at the neat blue lines filled with the anatomy of quiet greed, and answered with more calm than I would have thought possible a week earlier. "I am making sure no one gets to rewrite this later." She glanced at the list, then back at me, and I saw the moment she understood this was no longer a woman trying not to be hurt. This was a woman assembling a record. I closed the pad, aligned its edges with the table, and asked Sophie if she still had Margaret Ellis's number from the trust paperwork after Harold died. She did. She pulled out her phone and slid it across the table. I looked at the number for a moment before dialing, listening to the ring settle into the silence of my kitchen. By the time Margaret answered, I was no longer documenting betrayal. I was preparing its receipt. Margaret Ellis answered on the second ring in the same steady voice she had used at Harold's. Memorial, calm enough to quiet a room without ever asking for silence. She did not offer sympathy. She did not waste time pretending this was a social call. She asked one question. How urgent? I looked at the legal pad beneath my hand, at 6 pages of clean blue ink and the shape of my family laid out in their own words. By breakfast, I said. She arrived the next morning at 7:45 in a navy wool coat with a leather briefcase and the kind of expression that suggested she had already guessed more than I had said on the phone. Margaret had been Harold's attorney for 23 years and mine for 9. She knew where every trust document lived, which drawer held the original deed, and which relatives smiled too warmly when estate language entered a room. I met her in the kitchen before sunrise, coffee already brewed, the legal pad waiting between us. She read every page without interrupting. Once. Then again more slowly. She did not react to Vanessa's phrasing. Did not comment on Daniel's silence. She simply turned each page with one careful hand and, when she was done, placed both palms flat on the table and said, "All right. Let us make sure they inherit exactly what they earned." There are moments in life when clarity arrives so cleanly it feels almost holy. That was one of them. By 8:30, the kitchen table was covered in folders. The house deed. Harold's original trust. Bank access forms. Medical proxy. Durable power of attorney. Margaret moved through paperwork with the calm efficiency of a woman who had spent decades watching greed overestimate itself. She asked precise questions. Did Daniel have current access to any accounts? No. Had I added Vanessa to anything, ever? Absolutely not. Did anyone besides me have keys to the house? Daniel. Sophie. Vanessa by way of Daniel. Margaret made a note. Then she looked up and asked the only question that mattered. Who, exactly, do you trust? The answer came more quickly than I expected. One of them, I said. Margaret nodded as if she had suspected that already. By 9:15, the deed was being transferred into a protected trust with strict sale restrictions and no unilateral access. The house could not be listed, borrowed against, refinanced, or sold without conditions so specific. Vanessa would need divine intervention and 2 court orders to get around them. By 9:40, Daniel was removed as presumptive executor. By 10, all medical decision authority was reassigned. By 10:15, financial access was restructured, personal property inventory was updated, and a private distribution letter was drafted in language so clean there would be nothing emotional to argue with later. Harold's watch. The piano bench. My mother's silver. The library first editions. Every item assigned with surgical clarity. Sentiment, properly documented, becomes very difficult to steal. Sophie arrived just after 10:30 and stopped short at the sight of legal folders spread across the kitchen table. Margaret looked at her over the rim of her glasses and asked 3 questions in less than a minute. Did she understand discretion? Yes. Could she follow written instruction? Yes. Did she want the responsibility before her or only the comfort of being chosen? Sophie did not answer quickly. That was the right answer. Then she said, I do not want anything that is not mine. I just do not want them to take what is yours. Margaret studied her for one long moment, then slid a document across the table and tapped the signature line. By 11, Sophie was formally named successor trustee under limited conditions, contingent, supervised, and protected enough to keep her safe from the very people now smiling at me over lunch invitations. When the last signature dried, Margaret closed the folder, aligned the edges, and handed me a sealed envelope. Keep this where they will not think to look, she said. And act exactly as they expect. Frail. Grateful. Slightly overwhelmed. People reveal the most when they believe they are already winning. At 12:10, Daniel texted to confirm lunch at the club. Vanessa added a heart. I looked at the message while Margaret packed her briefcase and felt the quietest kind of relief settle over me. Not because I had regained control. Because they still believed I had none. I set the phone face down on the table, folded my hands over the sealed envelope, and understood that by the time my family sat down across from me that afternoon, the woman they thought they were managing no longer existed. The country club had not changed in 30 years. The same white columns at the entrance. The same brass planters flanking the front steps. The same polished dining room where women in soft cashmere discussed charity luncheons over chopped salads and men who had inherited their confidence spoke too loudly about markets and weather. Harold used to bring me there on Fridays when Daniel was little and still thought club soda with lime was a grown man's drink. It had once felt elegant. That afternoon, it felt like a stage set for bad theatre. Vanessa stood when I arrived, all concern and polished grace in a cream blouse and pearl earrings I had given her for her 10th anniversary. Daniel pulled out my chair before I reached the table, an old courtesy resurrected so suddenly it might have been touching if it had not arrived with such obvious timing. Vanessa had already ordered tea for me. Chamomile. She smiled as if anticipating my needs were proof of devotion and not rehearsal. You look tired, she said gently, as though she had earned the right to notice. I thanked her and sat down. Daniel asked if I had eaten breakfast. Vanessa asked if I had been sleeping. The waiter brought water. Menus opened. Concern bloomed everywhere, soft and fragrant and just expensive enough to be performative. It was almost impressive. I let them order for me. Half a turkey club on wheat. Fruit instead of fries. Vanessa made a small show of requesting the lighter option on my behalf, then laid one manicured hand over mine and said she had been thinking all morning about how best to ease the burden of the coming weeks. Burden. Another clean word. Daniel nodded solemnly beside her, his tie too tight, his grief arranged. We want to make this easier on you, he said. Whatever you need. Vanessa reached into her handbag and produced a slim leather folio with the kind of discreet elegance people mistake for good intentions. She set it beside her plate without opening it. Not yet. There are just a few practical things, she said, almost apologetically. Nothing stressful. We thought if we handled details now, you would not have to worry later. There it was. Not even soup had arrived. I looked at the folio. Daniel followed my gaze and straightened in his chair. It is just paperwork, he said too quickly. Only preliminary. Nothing final. Preliminary. Another lovely word. I folded my napkin in my lap and asked if people usually brought legal documents to lunch or only when someone else was paying the membership fees. Vanessa laughed first. Daniel did not. The waiter arrived with tea and spared them the silence. I let it steep untouched while Vanessa pivoted with practiced ease into gentler territory. She asked if I had considered hospice. She asked whether I wanted to stay in the house or somewhere with more support. She said support the way one might say upgrade. Then she mentioned, with studied hesitation, that maintaining a large property in winter could become unnecessarily complicated. I asked for whom. She smiled and looked down at her water. For everyone, she said. Of course. By the time lunch arrived, the folio was open. 3 neat tabs. Temporary authorization. Transitional planning. Property review. Vanessa did not slide the documents across the table. She angled them just enough for me to see where signatures belonged. Daniel kept his eyes on the bread plate between us. No pressure, he said. We just thought it would help to be prepared. I looked at my son, at the soft downward pull of his mouth, at the way he could not quite meet my eyes while helping arrange my exit from my own life, and I felt something colder than anger settle into place. Not because he had become cruel. Because he had become convenient. Vanessa began explaining the first page in a tone so patient it bordered on maternal. Temporary access. Administrative ease. Just in case. She spoke as though signatures were kindness and possession was responsibility with better tailoring. I let her finish. Then I placed both hands over the unopened tea she had ordered for me and asked, very quietly, do either of you know what the first thing a person loses is when they believe they are entitled to someone else's ending? Daniel finally looked up. Vanessa stopped mid-sentence. I held their eyes one at a time and gave them the only answer they had not prepared for. Their timing. Then I smiled, lifted my water glass, and suggested dessert. By the time dessert arrived, Vanessa had recovered enough to laugh at my remark as though I had made a clever little joke instead of a warning. That was one of her more reliable talents. She could turn discomfort into performance before most people had even recognized it. She ordered lemon cake for the table without asking what anyone wanted, then folded the papers back into her folio with deliberate calm, as if postponement and defeat were interchangeable. Daniel reached for his coffee and nearly missed the handle. I watched his hand steady itself against the saucer and wondered, not for the first time, when exactly my son had become the kind of man who mistook discomfort for conscience. Vanessa resumed speaking first. She always did. She said there was no rush. She said these things were emotional and complicated. She said they only wanted to protect me from stress. Then she asked, lightly enough to sound casual, whether I had told anyone else about my condition. Not the diagnosis. The condition. As if the word itself made me easier to inventory. I dabbed the corner of my mouth with my napkin and said I had begun making arrangements. That much, at least, was true. Daniel leaned forward. What kind of arrangements? He asked. There it was again. Not how are you feeling? Not what do you need? Arrangements. I let the question sit long enough to become impolite. Then I told him I had spoken with Margaret. Vanessa's smile changed first. It did not disappear. It tightened. One careful inch at the corners. Margaret Ellis, she asked, too quickly for the name to sound incidental. I nodded. Yesterday morning. Daniel set down his coffee. Vanessa's fingers stilled on the folio clasp. A woman can learn a great deal from what people stop touching when they are nervous. I thought maybe that would be easier on everyone, I said. Vanessa recovered almost immediately. Of course, she said. That makes sense. It is good to have things organized. There was a faint strain under the sentence now, the first hairline crack beneath all that polish. Did she suggest any immediate changes? She asked, and there it was at last. Not grief. Not concern. The real question, finally dressed in its own clothes. I looked at her and smiled the way women do when they have no intention of answering directly. She suggested clarity, I said. I have always found that useful. Dessert went mostly untouched. Daniel pushed his fork through lemon cake until it looked like rubble. Vanessa smiled too often. The lunch ended with too much courtesy and not enough appetite. Daniel insisted on walking me to the car. Vanessa remained at the table to settle the bill, though all three of us knew Daniel would later expense it through the business as some version of family obligation. At the curb, with the afternoon sun reflecting off the windshield and the valet idling 2 cars behind us, Daniel finally let his expression slip. "Mom," he said quietly, "you know we are only trying to help." I looked at my son standing in polished loafers on club pavement, 41 years old and still hoping tone might excuse motive. "Then help me by being honest," I said. He opened his mouth and closed it again. The valet handed me my keys. Daniel stepped back. He did not say another word. I drove home with both windows cracked and the October air moving clean through the car, carrying off the perfume of club dining rooms and rehearsed concern. When I turned onto my street, Sophie's sedan was already in the driveway. She was sitting on the front porch with her knees drawn up, Harold's old cardigan around her shoulders, a grocery bag at her feet and my spare house key looped around one finger. She stood when she saw me and came down the front steps before I had fully shut the car door. "How bad was it?" she asked. I looked past her at my house, at the white porch railing Harold painted every spring, at the upstairs window where I had once stood listening to my son measure my death in timing and paperwork. Then I looked at my granddaughter, the only person waiting for me without an agenda in her hands. "Predictable," I said, and handed her the sealed envelope Margaret had given me that morning. Sophie looked down at it, then back at me. "What is this?" she asked. I closed the car door, took the grocery bag from her hand, and started toward the house. The part they still think they have time to stop. 2 nights later, I invited them all to dinner again. Sunday. 6 o'clock. Pot roast. Yeast rolls. Peach cobbler. The same menu. The same table. The same gold-rimmed china. There is a certain kind of mercy in repetition. It gives people one last chance to notice they are being watched. Vanessa arrived with a bottle of wine and a face arranged into solemn tenderness. Daniel carried flowers this time. White roses. An upgrade from lilies, perhaps meant to suggest refinement where sincerity had failed. Sophie came 10 minutes early and set the cobbler on the counter without needing to be asked. She wore Harold's cardigan again. Margaret arrived at 5:58, precisely on time, and took the seat to my right with the quiet ease of a woman who had long ago learned how to sit in a room where only one person knew why she was there. Vanessa's smile faltered when she saw her. Only for a second. But a second is all truth ever needs. Dinner passed in the careful, brittle politeness of people trying to behave normally while privately calculating the shape of an ending. Daniel asked if I was comfortable. Vanessa asked if I had eaten enough. Margaret complimented the roast. Sophie said very little and watched everything. I let them perform. I let the plates empty. I let dessert arrive. Then I folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, and told them there was something I needed to say before coffee. Vanessa straightened first. Daniel set down his fork. Sophie did not move. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and waited. "I am not dying," I said. No one spoke. Even the clock in the hallway seemed to miss a beat. Daniel blinked once, hard enough to look pained. Vanessa did not blink at all. "I beg your pardon," she said, though she had heard me perfectly. I looked at my son. Then at his wife. "I am not dying," I repeated. "There is no terminal diagnosis. No specialist. No 2 weeks. I wanted to know what would happen if. The 3 of you believed I was almost gone." Daniel went pale in the exact same way he had at dinner 2 Sundays earlier, only this time there was nowhere left to hide his silence. Vanessa gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "You lied to us?" she asked, each word sharpened by outrage too quick to be grief. I observed you, I said. There is a difference. Daniel opened his mouth, but Margaret slid a sealed folder onto the table before he found anything useful to say. The sound it made against the wood was quiet. Final. Vanessa looked at it first. Of course she did. Margaret spoke in the same measured tone she had used in my kitchen, calm enough to make interruption look childish. She explained the trust had been amended. The house had been placed under protected restriction. No sale, transfer, refinance, or occupancy change could occur without terms neither of them could satisfy. Daniel had been removed as executor. All discretionary authority had been reassigned. Personal assets had been distributed by private inventory. Medical authority had been revoked and replaced. Sophie, under supervision and condition, had been named successor trustee. Daniel stared at the folder as though language itself had betrayed him. Vanessa did not look at the papers. She looked at me. For the first time in 12 years, she looked at me without polish. You set us up, she said quietly. I took a sip of water and set the glass down with more care than the accusation deserved. No, I said. I gave you 2 weeks to be decent. Daniel finally found his voice. It came out smaller than I had ever heard it. Mom, I never would have let anything happen to you. I looked at my son and thought of driveways, club lunches, property review tabs, and all the ways a person can stand beside harm without ever needing to cause it themselves. That was the problem, I said. You kept letting things happen. Vanessa pushed back her chair first. Not dramatically. Just enough to reveal that leaving had already occurred to her before apology had. Margaret placed one hand over the folder and said, almost kindly, you should read before you speak again. Sophie rose to collect the dessert plates. Daniel did not stop her. No one did. The room had become very still. Not broken. Clarified. I looked around the table at what remained of my family and felt no triumph, only precision. Harold had once told me that the final measure of character is not what a person reaches for when they are comfortable, but what they reveal when they believe there will be no consequences. I poured my coffee. Sophie set a cup beside me. Margaret opened her notes. Across the table, Daniel said nothing. Vanessa, for once, had run out of useful words. And in the silence that followed, the only inheritance anyone had left to claim was the truth.